She walked into the party like an invisible person, calloused hands, cheap dress, the smell of kitchen grease still clinging to her hair. But that night, the most powerful man in the city opened his car door for her, not for any of the hundreds of ladies in designer clothes standing there. And when she appeared a second time on the grand entrance, the room fell silent as if someone had sucked all the air out of it. The man who had mocked her stood frozen. Cameras clicked, and she didn't smile at any of them. If you want to know how an ordinary woman can bring down an empire, watch until the end. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. The snow came down wrong that night. Not the soft, cinematic kind that lands on windowsills and makes children press their faces to the glass. This was Blackthorne City snow. Wet, heavy, mean, the kind that soaked through your coat in under 3 minutes and left you shivering in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. It fell sideways across the canyon of steel and glass that was the Harwick Financial District, cutting visibility down to half a block. And somewhere above the clouds, the new year was already counting down whether anyone was ready for it or not. Sienna Vale was not ready. She was standing in the service alley behind the Aldermore Grand Hotel, with her back against the cold brick wall and her hands pressed flat against her thighs to keep them from shaking. Not from cold, from something worse than cold. She'd been out here 4 minutes. She knew because she'd been counting, the way she always counted when the world got too loud and her chest got too tight, an old habit from childhood that had never fully left her. And in those 4 minutes, she had not cried. She considered that a minor victory. She was 24 years old. She had worked 14-hour shifts since she was 16. She had buried her mother 8 months ago in a cemetery plot her mother had paid for in installments, $20 a month, 4 years running, because that was the kind of woman her mother was. The kind who planned for her own death because she couldn't afford to leave anyone else holding the bill. Sienna had stood at that graveside in borrowed shoes that were half a size too small, and she had not cried then either. She was good at not crying. She'd had a lot of practice. What she was not good at was standing very still in service alleys while the image played on a loop behind her eyes. Callum Pierce's hand against the small of Anya Reeves' back, his mouth against her jaw. The particular angle of his shoulders that meant he was comfortable. That meant this was not the first time. That meant everything Sienna had believed about the last 11 months of her life was a careful and deliberate lie. She pressed her palms harder against her thighs. Breathe. The alley smelled like garbage steam from the kitchen vents and diesel from the delivery trucks that had been coming and going all evening. She could hear the muffled bass of the gala orchestra through 3 floors of concrete and insulation. Someone in the kitchen was shouting about a sauce reduction. The normal sounds of a world that did not care what had just happened to her, a world that was simply continuing on its axis, indifferent, enormous, cold. She had been a line cook at the Aldermore Grand for 2 years. She had gotten the job by lying on her application about her formal training, she had none, and then making up for it by arriving 45 minutes early every shift for the first 3 months, until she knew the kitchen better than people who'd been there for years. Chef Morrow had taken one look at her knife work on the second day and told her she had the hands of someone who'd been cooking since she could reach the stove. He wasn't wrong. She'd been cooking since she was 9. You learned fast when the alternative was not eating. Callum Pierce had walked into that kitchen 7 months after she started. He was the heir apparent to Pierce Hospitality Group, 12 restaurants across Blackthorne, a boutique hotel in Meridian Coast, a catering empire that fed half the city's elite fundraisers. And he'd come to inspect the kitchen before a private event his family was co-hosting. He'd worn a charcoal suit, and he'd smelled like something expensive, and he'd looked at her across a row of prep stations with the particular attention of a man who was used to getting what he looked at. She should have known better. She'd known better. She'd told herself she knew better every single week for the first 2 months they were together, a quiet internal monologue of warnings that she systematically ignored because he was kind to her in ways she hadn't expected, or thought she saw kindness, which in retrospect might have been the same as being fooled by it, and because the loneliness of her life had become something physical by then, a weight that sat in her sternum, and Callum Pierce had made it lighter for a while. 11 months. She'd given him 11 months. She pulled her phone out of her coat pocket. No messages. Of course no messages. Callum had seen her face when she'd found them together behind the ballroom curtain, that moment of pure raw shock before she'd gotten her expression back under control, That half second where everything she felt had been visible. And he had laughed. Not an embarrassed laugh, not a guilty laugh, just a laugh, casual and dismissive, like a man who'd knocked over a glass and wasn't particularly interested in cleaning it up. "What did you think this was?" he'd said. And then, when she hadn't answered fast enough, still processing, still standing there like an idiot in the dress she'd bought on sale 3 weeks ago and altered herself because she couldn't afford a tailor, he'd said the rest of it. Loud enough for the two socialites near the curtain to hear, loud enough for the photographer who'd been shooting candids near the champagne display, loud enough for it to matter. "You were never built for this world, Sienna. You know that, right? I mean, look at you. Look at your hands. You smell like a restaurant. You grew up in Portside." He'd smiled, and it was worse than the cruelty because there was pity in it. The pity of someone who has never been hungry looking at someone who has always been hungry and finding it vaguely amusing. "I was never going to introduce you to my family. I thought you understood what this was." She hadn't said anything. She'd turned and walked away with her spine straight and her face composed, and she'd made it all the way through the ballroom, through the lobby, through the main service corridor and out the side exit before her hands had started shaking. 4 minutes ago. She was still counting. The alley door swung open behind her and she spun, already braced. But it was just Marco, one of the junior prep cooks, ducking out for a smoke break. He took one look at her face and stopped. "You okay?" "Fine." He studied her for another second with the careful uncertainty of a person who knows someone is not fine, but also knows better than to push it. Then he nodded, lit his cigarette, and looked at the wall. Sienna appreciated that about Marco. He understood the value of silence. She needed to leave. She needed to get her bag from the staff locker, get her coat, get on the number 9 bus back to Portside, and go home to the one-bedroom apartment she'd been renting since her mother died. The apartment that still had her mother's handwriting on the inside of the kitchen cabinet where her mother had measured her heights as a child. The apartment that was too quiet now in ways that had nothing to do with sound. She needed to do all of that, and she needed to do it without falling apart in public, which was not negotiable. She pushed off the wall. "Night, Marco." "Night." She walked to the far end of the alley where it opened onto the side street that ran along the hotel's north face. The street was mostly empty. The gala crowd had all arrived hours ago, and regular foot traffic had thinned to nothing in the cold. A black town car sat idling at the curb near the alley mouth, which she registered and dismissed without much thought. Town cars were furniture in this part of the city, part of the landscape, as unremarkable as the lampposts. She walked past it. The rear window came down. She kept walking. "Ms. Vale?" She stopped. Not because of the voice, although the voice was the kind that stopped people, low and measured, carrying the particular unhurried quality of someone who had never once in their life needed to raise it to get a result. She stopped because of her name. Not Sienna, not Heyu. Ms. Vale, precise and deliberate, like a man who'd looked it up. She turned slowly. The car was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, black on black, the kind of vehicle that existed at such a remove from her daily life that it registered less as a car and more as a concept. The rear door was open now. The man sitting inside was looking at her without expression, not coldly, but without the social performance most people defaulted to when they looked at other people. The small, reflexive warmth, the slight upward curve of the mouth. He had none of that. He just looked. He was perhaps 35. Sharp jaw, dark hair cut close on the sides. A black suit that cost more than 4 months of her rent. Silver cufflinks. His hands were folded in his lap and he wore a ring on his right hand, silver, thick-banded, the kind of jewelry that wasn't decorative. His eyes were gray, not pale gray. Deeper than that, the color of the river in winter just before it froze. She didn't know his name yet. She knew his face. Everyone in Blackthorne City knew his face, even if they pretended not to, even if they looked away when his name came up in conversation, the way you looked away from certain things because looking directly at them was a declaration of intention you weren't prepared to make. "You should get in," he said. "It's going to get colder." "I don't know you." "You know who I am." She did. That was the problem. She stood on the wet sidewalk in her inadequate coat with snow melting in her hair, and looked at Roman Castelli and understood with the particular clarity that sometimes comes in the worst moments of your life that this conversation was going to change something. She didn't know what. She didn't know whether that was a reason to get in the car or a reason to walk away faster. "Why do you know my name?" she said. "Get in, and I'll tell you." That's not how trust works. Something shifted in his face. Not much, a barely perceptible thing, the closest he apparently came to being surprised. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those Winter River eyes, and then he said, "Your father's name was Daniel Vale. He worked the South Docks at Portside Harbor. He died 11 years ago when a cargo crane collapsed during a storm. They gave him a 10-minute memorial at the Union Hall and a check for $4,000. Sienna's throat closed. "He deserved considerably more than that," Roman said. "Get in, Ms. Vale. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to explain something that's been owed to you for a long time." She should not have gotten in the car. She knew that. She cataloged it clearly, the way she cataloged everything. The risk assessment, the absolute insanity of getting into a vehicle with a man like this on the word of her dead father's name. And then she got in the car anyway, because he had said her father's name with a weight that felt like actual knowledge, not performance, and because the alternative was the number 9 bus back to Portside, and an empty apartment and 4 more minutes of standing in a wet alley counting the seconds of her own humiliation. The door closed. The car moved. Inside it was warm in a way that felt almost obscene after the wet cold of the street. Roman sat across from her. The rear compartment was large enough for facing seats, and he did not immediately speak. He looked out the window at the passing city with the detached attention of someone who had seen it so many times it had stopped containing surprises. Sienna sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the partition between the compartment and the driver and tried to remember how to breathe normally. "My father saved your life," she said. It wasn't a question. The way he'd said the name had already told her that much. 11 years ago, August. There was a confrontation on the South Docks, not the kind of thing that ends up in incident reports. 3 men came for me. Your father was working late. He saw what was happening, and he intervened. Roman turned from the window and looked at her directly. He didn't know who I was. He just saw 3 men against 1 and made a choice. He took a knife meant for me, and he spent 4 days in the hospital, and then he went back to work and never told anyone. He never told us. No, I know. He died 6 months later. Yes. The word landed flat and final, and she had the sense he'd carried it a long time. She studied his face for something she recognized: guilt, grief, the ordinary human residue of debt, and found something quieter than any of those things. Something that had been held still for years until it became simply part of the architecture. "You've been watching my family," she said. "Watching over. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Your mother's hospital bills in the last year of her treatment were partially covered by a subsidy through the City Health Coalition. The coalition receives a portion of its funding from a private foundation." He paused. "The foundation is mine." Sienna sat with that for a moment. The number 9 bus, the borrowed shoes at the graveside, the $20 a month cemetery plot installments her mother had arranged because she was the kind of woman who planned for her own dying. She thought about all the small mercies she'd attributed to luck or timing or the occasional kindness of bureaucratic systems, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not warmth, not gratitude yet. Something more complicated than either of those. A kind of vertigo that came from the sudden realization that the map of your own life had been slightly different from the map you thought you'd been reading. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. Roman reached inside his jacket and produced a slim envelope, which he held out to her. She took it carefully. Inside was a printed card, the Aldermore Grand Hotel crest at the top, a reservation confirmation, and below it a brief handwritten line: "Dressing room 4, North Wing. Ask for Margot." "What is this?" "An offer," he said. "Tonight is the New Year Gala. You were humiliated in that building an hour ago by a man who believed your background made you disposable. You can leave. Take the bus home. It's a reasonable choice." He looked at her with that same flat, unperformative directness. Or you can walk back into that gala on my arm and let every person who laughed at you tonight see exactly what they overlooked. This isn't charity. No, it's a debt. You don't owe me anything. You owed my father. Your father is dead, Roman said without cruelty, simply stating the fact the way you stated geography. The debt transfers. Sienna looked at the card in her hands. She thought about Callum's face, the particular sound of his laugh, casual, dismissive, the laugh of someone who had never once questioned whether he belonged somewhere. She thought about the socialites near the curtain and the photographer, and the way the crowd had drifted toward the sound of her humiliation, the way crowds always drift toward spectacle, drawn by the smell of blood even when they pretend otherwise. She thought about her father, Daniel Vale, who had intervened in a fight that wasn't his business, because he saw 3 against 1 and made a choice. "If I go back in there with you," she said slowly, "what do you get out of it?" Roman almost smiled. It was a contained thing, not quite reaching, but present. "A debt cleared. That's all." "That's all," he said. She didn't believe him entirely, but she kept the card. Dressing room 4 was small and lit by makeup mirrors, and Margot turned out to be a woman in her 50s with silver hair scraped back from her face and the efficient, unsentimental manner of someone who had spent her career making other people presentable and had strong opinions about the work. She looked Sienna over once, top to bottom, the way a craftsperson looks at raw material, not unkindly but without sentiment, and said, "Sit down, we have 40 minutes. "I don't need—" "Sit down." Sienna sat down. What followed was the strangest 40 minutes of her life. Margot moved around her with the focused efficiency of a woman on a deadline, and Sienna sat in the chair and let it happen, which felt deeply unnatural, because she was a person who did things rather than had things done to her, who had been managing her own appearance with drugstore products in a bathroom with bad lighting for her entire adult life, and the experience of someone else's hands in her hair and the weight of actual jewelry against her collarbone, and the particular slide of silk as she was zipped into a dress that cost more than her monthly rent felt like something happening to a different version of herself. The dress was crimson. Not red, crimson, deeper and more deliberate, the color of something decided. It fit her like it had been made for her, which was impossible, except that when she mentioned this, Margot said simply, "It was," and moved on before Sienna could process what that meant. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror when Margot was done. She didn't recognize herself immediately. Not in the way of transformation stories, not the gasp and stare of someone encountering their own potential for the first time. It was more unsettling than that. The woman in the mirror was still recognizably her. Same jawline, same scar on her left hand from a knife slip 4 years ago, same eyes, but all the careful invisibility she'd constructed over years, the studied unremarkability that let her move through spaces without costing anyone anything, was simply gone. She looked like someone who took up space without apology. She wasn't sure she knew how to be that person. Roman was waiting in the corridor outside, and when she emerged, he looked at her the same way he'd looked at her in the alley, directly, without the small theatrical beat most men inserted when they wanted you to know they were looking. And he said nothing for a moment, then, "Ready?" "No," she said honestly. "Good," he said. "Means you're paying attention." They walked into the gala together at 11:17. The timing was deliberate. She understood that without being told. Late enough that the room was full, that every important person was already positioned with their drink in hand and their social armor assembled, that there was nowhere for attention to go except toward new arrivals on the main staircase. Roman's hand rested at the small of her back, light, not possessive, just present enough to indicate a relationship that everyone in this room would spend the next 10 minutes trying to categorize and failing. The room turned, not all at once. It happened in waves, the way attention moves through a crowded space, one person noticing and nudging another, a ripple of redirected focus that swept across the ballroom from the base of the staircase outward until it reached the far corners and turned even the people who'd been deep in conversation. Camera flashes ignited. The event photographers, the social press people, the guests with phones already out in the reflexive documentation of modern spectacle. Sienna kept her eyes forward. She did not look for Callum. She did not need to. She could feel the specific quality of the silence from the direction of the Pierce family table without needing to confirm it with her eyes, the way you could feel weather before it arrived. She descended the staircase one step at a time, spine straight, chin level, and the crimson silk moved around her like something alive. Roman said quietly, near her ear, "Don't look at him." "I wasn't going to." "You were thinking about it." She was. She adjusted her gaze half a degree away from the Pierce table and focused on the far wall instead, on the enormous window that looked out over the snow-covered city, the skyline blazing against the black winter sky, and she thought, "I am still here. I am still here, and I am still standing, and you do not get the satisfaction of watching me disappear." They reached the floor. A waiter appeared with champagne. Roman took 2 glasses without looking and handed her one, and she took it, and they stood together at the edge of the room while the city's elite quietly rearranged their understanding of the night. She felt it before she heard it. The particular atmospheric pressure change that preceded Callum Pierce's approach, some animal-level warning that she hadn't known she had until it fired. He stopped 6 feet away, a champagne glass in his hand and a look on his face that was working very hard at amusement and landing somewhere closer to distress. "Sienna." He said it like he was correcting a mistake. "What are you—" "Callum Pierce," Roman said. He didn't look at Callum. He was looking at the window, at the city. "I know your father." The particular way Roman said no, present tense, deliberate, loaded with the specific weight of a man who had spent decades understanding exactly what information was worth and when to deploy it, made Callum stop speaking. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," Roman said. Callum stood there for 3 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then he left. Sienna exhaled slowly through her nose and did not let it show anywhere above the neck. "He's going to come back," she said. "Yes," Roman agreed, "but not yet. He needs to make some phone calls first." "What phone calls?" Roman finally looked at her, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen there before, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent. The recognition of a person who had just done something harder than it looked. "You'll understand by midnight, but," he said. The orchestra shifted into something slower. The crowd began to redistribute itself across the room, conversations reforming, the moment of disruption already being metabolized into gossip, into story, into the particular currency of gala small talk. Sienna stood with her champagne and watched the room and felt the adrenaline in her bloodstream begin to settle into something she couldn't immediately name. She thought about her father, about the South Docks at night in August, a fight that wasn't his business, a choice made without calculation. She thought about the woman in the dressing room mirror. Not a different person, she understood that now. The same person. Just without the invisibility she'd been wearing so long, she'd mistaken it for skin. On the other side of the room, she watched Callum Pierce step away from the party and put his phone to his ear, and the expression on his face as he waited for the call to connect was the expression of a man who had just noticed the ground was softer than he'd thought. Roman was still looking at her. "What did you mean," she said, "when you said he'd need to make phone calls first?" Roman set his champagne glass on a passing tray. His jaw was set in a particular way, not tense, resolved, like a man who had already decided something a long time ago and was simply watching the decision arrive. "Before you came out of that dressing room," he said, "federal investigators filed a sealed motion in Blackthorne District Court. By midnight, it won't be sealed anymore." He looked at her with those flat gray eyes. Callum Pierce's father has been running labor trafficking operations through 6 of his restaurants for 4 years. The workers thought they were signing legitimate employment contracts. They were signing debt bondage agreements. A pause. "I've been holding the evidence for 8 months, waiting for the right moment to submit it." Sienna went very still. "Why 8 months?" she said. "Because the federal prosecutor needed time to build independent corroboration. I couldn't submit evidence that had my name on it without—" "No," she said. "Why did you wait for tonight?" Roman was quiet for a long moment. The orchestra played something she didn't recognize. Snow pressed itself silently against the enormous window. "Because," he said finally, "tonight he was going to introduce Anya Reeve as his official partner at the family table, in front of cameras, in front of his father's investors." He looked at her steadily. I needed him to do it in front of witnesses before the arrest. Character on record. She understood what he was saying, and she understood what he wasn't saying. And the space between those two things was very large and very complicated, and she wasn't ready to walk into it yet. You knew about Anya Reeve, she said. You knew what was going to happen tonight. Yes. You knew he was going to humiliate me. Roman didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was the same as always. Level, unhurried, giving nothing extra. I knew what he was capable of. I didn't know you'd be in that alley when I arrived. But you came to the alley. I came to the hotel. You were in the alley. He held her gaze. The rest was your choice. Across the room, Callum Pierce's face had gone the particular color of a man receiving very bad news. His phone was still pressed to his ear. His father had just appeared beside him. A bigger, older version of the same face, the same jaw, but carrying 20 more years of certainty that the world worked the way he thought it did. And the older man's expression was curdling in real time from irritation to alarm. Sienna watched it happen. She thought, by midnight. She thought, I don't know what I've walked into. She thought, I don't know if that matters anymore. On the ornate clock above the ballroom's north archway, the minute hand moved with the slow mechanical indifference of time that did not care about any of them. And somewhere below the city's glittering surface, deep in the infrastructure of money and fear and debt that held Blackthorne together, something Roman Castelli had been building for 8 months was about to come apart in the most public way possible. Callum Pierce turned from his phone call and found her eyes across the crowd. And this time, the look on his face was not amusement. It was the beginning of understanding, the dawning, sick realization of a man who has just noticed that the pieces on the board are not arranged the way he thought they were, that someone has been playing a different game entirely, and that he is already several moves behind. Sienna held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned away and lifted her champagne and looked out at the snow-covered city beyond the glass. She did not smile, but she breathed, finally, like a person who had been holding her breath for a very long time. Outside, the snow kept falling. The city glittered in the dark. And somewhere in the sealed chambers of Blackthorne District Court, a document with the Pierce family's name at the top was waiting, patient and inevitable, for the clock to reach midnight. The clock above the north archway read 11:31. Sienna knew this because she had looked at it 3 times in the last 4 minutes. Not because she cared about the time, but because looking at the clock gave her somewhere to put her eyes that wasn't Callum Pierce. He was still on the far side of the room with his father, and the conversation between them had the particular physical quality of 2 people arguing in the specific register of men who had been arguing the same argument for decades. Shoulders locked, faces controlled for the audience, hands moving in tight, contained gestures that wanted to be larger. Whatever his father was saying, Callum didn't like it. He kept shaking his head. His father grabbed his arm once, briefly, and Callum pulled free with the practiced speed of someone who had been doing that since childhood. Roman had left her side 20 minutes ago. Not dramatically. He'd simply said, "Stay visible," in a low voice near her ear, and then moved away into the room with the quiet purposefulness of a man who had somewhere specific to be and no interest in explaining himself. She'd watched him cross the ballroom floor and disappear through a side corridor that she knew from her kitchen access led to the hotel's private meeting rooms on the mezzanine level. Stay visible. Like she was a piece on a board. Like her job tonight was simply to exist in the right part of the room and let other people's eyes find her. She took a slow breath and adjusted her grip on the champagne glass and reminded herself that she had agreed to this, that no one had made her get in the car, that she was a person who made her own choices and this had been one of them, and the time for second-guessing was not in the middle of a ballroom with 200 people in her peripheral vision. A woman appeared beside her, late 40s, red dress, the kind of haircut that required a significant financial commitment to maintain, and looked at Sienna with the particular expression of someone who wants information and has decided that the most efficient way to get it is to pretend to be friendly. "I don't think we've met," the woman said. "Helena Marsh. I write the Blackthorne social column for the Meridian Courier." "I know who you are," Sienna said, "and you're Sienna Vale." Helena Marsh's expression calibrated itself with impressive speed, recording the name, filing it, running whatever internal database she maintained of Blackthorne's social architecture, finding nothing, adjusting. You came in with Roman Castelli. Yes. Have you known him long? Sienna looked at her. Are you working right now? A small smile. I'm always working. Then I don't have anything for you. Sienna turned back to the room. Helena Marsh didn't leave. She stood there for another moment with the practiced patience of someone who knew that silence made people uncomfortable enough to fill it. But Sienna had grown up with a mother who worked double shifts and came home too tired to talk, and silence was not a discomfort she'd ever learned to be afraid of. Eventually, Helena drifted away toward more cooperative territory. Sienna exhaled and set her half-finished champagne on the nearest surface and tried to think clearly. He'd known for 8 months. That was the thing she kept returning to. Not the federal investigation. That was Roman's world, the machinery of power operating at a level she didn't pretend to fully understand. But the personal geometry of it. Roman had known what Callum was. He had known what Callum was doing to those workers, to those people who'd signed documents they didn't fully understand in a language some of them barely read. And he had known what Callum was doing to Sienna, the careful, prolonged performance of a relationship that was never intended to be real. And he had held that knowledge for 8 months and said nothing. He had waited. She didn't know how to feel about that. She was aware that the feeling she was reaching for wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was something more jagged than gratitude, something that sat between relief and the particular cold anger of finding out that someone else had been making decisions about your life without consulting you. You look like you're doing math, said a voice. She turned. The man was around Roman's age, maybe a year or two older, broad-shouldered in a dark suit with no tie, his collar open in a way that managed to look deliberate rather than careless. He had a drink in each hand, not champagne, something amber, and he held one out to her with the directness of someone who'd already decided she needed it. I'm fine, she said. You've been standing alone for 18 minutes looking at the clock. That's not fine, that's waiting for something. He kept the glass extended. Take it. It's not poisoned. It's Aldermore's 18-year scotch, which they don't put out for the regular guests because they know the regular guests wouldn't appreciate it. She took it, because he was right about the waiting. Dario Vasquez, he said, keeping the other glass for himself. The name registered. It would have registered for anyone in Blackthorne who paid even minimal attention to the city's undercurrent. Dario Vasquez was Roman's. She searched for the right word and couldn't find a clean one. Second, operational head. The man who ran the day-to-day mechanics of the Castelli organization while Roman operated at the strategic level. He sent you to watch me, she said. He asked me to make sure you weren't alone. Dario tilted his glass slightly. There's a difference. Everyone keeps telling me there's a difference between things that look the same. He almost laughed. It was a real sound, not a performance. Fair. Okay. He sent me to watch you. Happy? Not particularly. The scotch helps. It did, actually. It was nothing like the champagne. No sweetness, no ceremony, just something that landed in the chest with the honest weight of something that didn't pretend to be other than what it was. She took a second sip and felt the shaking in her hands diminish slightly. How long have you worked for him? She asked. 14 years? He said it without hesitation, without the defensive pause people inserted when they weren't sure how much to admit. Since I was 22 and running protection for a warehouse district that didn't belong to anyone respectable. He found me. Gave me a choice. A pause. Different kind of choice than the one he gave you tonight. What does that mean? Dario looked at her sideways. It means yours came with a dress and a staircase entrance. Mine came with a very small room and a very specific question about whether I wanted to keep doing what I was doing or do something that actually mattered. He shrugged. Different packaging, same basic architecture. He collects people, she said. Not accusatory, just naming a thing she was starting to see. He pays debts, Dario said. It's not the same as collecting. Collecting is about ownership. Paying debts is about... He stopped. I don't know. Accounting. Some internal balance sheet that I've never fully understood. But it's real. Whatever Roman Castelli is, he's consistent. He looked across the room toward the corridor Roman had disappeared into. That counts for more than most people realize. Before she could respond, the temperature of the room changed. She felt it first. A collective subtle shift in attention, the kind of atmospheric readjustment that happened when something significant moved through a space. She turned and found the source. Callum Pearce was walking toward her, not with his father, alone. His jacket was slightly less perfect than it had been an hour ago, one button undone at the cuff, his face carrying the particular flushed, over-controlled look of a man who had been drinking to stay calm and had miscalculated the dosage. He moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had been moving through rooms like this his entire life, people shifting instinctively to make way, and he stopped 3 feet from her with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes moving from her to Dario and back to her. Dario hadn't moved. He stood at her left shoulder with his scotch in his hand and the specific stillness of someone who was comfortable waiting to see how things developed. "I need to talk to you," Callum said to Sienna. "No, you don't," she said. "Sienna, we're done talking. We were done talking in the ballroom corridor 2 hours ago. I don't have anything left for you." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand what's happening tonight." "I understand fine. You don't." He stepped forward half a pace and she held her ground, and he seemed to register that, the fact that she wasn't stepping back. And something shifted in his face, recalibrating. "Whatever he told you, whatever Roman Castelli told you about me or my family, you need to understand that he has his own reasons for..." "For what?" she said. "For the workers in your restaurants, the ones who signed contracts they didn't understand? Those are his reasons?" Callum's face went very still. "You knew," she said. She hadn't been certain until she saw his face, but the stillness confirmed it. Not surprise, just the particular arrested quality of a man who has been caught in a knowledge he can't now deny. "You knew what your father was running. It's more complicated than..." "Don't." The word came out flat and final, and she didn't recognize her own voice, the cleanness of it, the absence of the apologetic softening she'd been wrapping her words in for years. "Don't explain it to me. Don't tell me it's complicated. People signed papers they couldn't read and ended up in debt they couldn't pay, and you knew, and you kept eating the food they cooked in those kitchens." She held his eyes. "That's what it is. You don't get to make it complicated." Callum's mouth opened and closed. For a moment he looked genuinely young, not in a sympathetic way, but in the way of someone who has never been contradicted by anyone he considered beneath him, and doesn't have the internal architecture to process it cleanly. The flush in his face deepened. "You came in here with Roman Castelli," he said, and his voice had shifted, the conversational register dropping towards something uglier. "You understand what he is, what he actually does? You want to talk about people being exploited?" "Walk away," Dario said. Quiet. Not loud at all. Callum looked at him. Dario looked back. The exchange lasted maybe 4 seconds, and at the end of it, Callum Pearce took a breath and straightened his jacket and looked back at Sienna with something in his face that was past anger now, past justification, settling into the colder, more dangerous register of a man making a decision. "You think this is over," he said to her. "This isn't over." He left. Sienna stood with the scotch in her hand and felt her pulse in her temples and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, without looking at Dario, "Is he going to be a problem?" "He already is one," Dario said. "Question is what kind." He watched Callum move back toward the Pearce family table, where his father was standing with 2 other men in suits who had the specific posture of lawyers on an emergency retainer. The kind that caves when the pressure gets real, or the kind that gets stupid? "Which do you think?" Dario was quiet for a second. "Stupid," he said. "Rich men's sons who've never lost anything always go stupid when they finally start losing." She thought he was probably right. The next hour moved in fragments, the way time moved when you were operating on adrenaline and inadequate food, and the continuous low-grade effort of maintaining composure in a room full of people who were watching you and talking about you in tones just below audible. Roman returned from the mezzanine at 10 past midnight, or rather, at 10 past 11, she corrected herself. They hadn't reached midnight yet. And he appeared at her side without announcement and stood there for a moment before saying anything. "The motion unseals at midnight," he said. "I know. You told me." The Pearce family's legal team has been aware for the last 40 minutes. Callum's father has been on the phone with 3 separate attorneys. He looked across the room. "He's going to try to leave before midnight. His security team is already moving a vehicle to the side exit. Can he? No, Roman said simply. She looked at him. You have people on the exits. The federal marshals have people on the exits. I simply made a call to confirm the timing. He paused. There's a distinction. There you go again with the distinctions. They matter, he said, and for the first time she heard something in his voice that might have been the distant cousin of amusement. It was gone quickly. There are things happening tonight beyond the Pierce situation that you should be aware of. She turned to face him more fully. Tell me. A faction operating out of the East Meridian corridor, you don't need their name, has been watching tonight's events with interest. They've been looking for a window to move against my organization for several months. A public scandal, federal attention, the optics of law enforcement interest. These things create a perceived vulnerability. He looked at her steadily. I want you to understand that tonight carries risk beyond what we discussed. You're telling me this now. I'm telling you this now because you're intelligent enough to notice something is wrong, and I'd rather you have accurate information than a partial picture. She stood with that. The ballroom stretched around them. 200 people drinking and networking and performing the complex social theater of wealth maintaining itself. And somewhere in the margins of this gathering, she understood there was something else operating, something that wore a different kind of suit. What do you want me to do? She asked. Stay close. I've been staying close. I mean, physically close. Within 10 feet. The next 90 minutes may move quickly, and I need to be able to move without looking for you. She should have said something about that, about the particular presumption embedded in the request. The assumption that she would simply restructure herself around his operational needs, that her proximity was something he could schedule. She was aware of all the things she should have said. Okay, she said. They moved through the room together, not circulating in the social sense, not working the crowd, but moving with the specific purposefulness of two people navigating toward a particular point. Roman spoke quietly to 3 different men during the next 20 minutes, brief exchanges, each lasting under a minute, and Sienna stood close enough to hear and far enough away to maintain the impression of not listening and absorbed what she could. Names she didn't recognize, references to positions and movements that were clearly spatial rather than financial. The word convoy once dropped casually, disappearing into the ambient noise of the orchestra. At 11:50, the Pierce family table detonated. It wasn't loud at first. The first indication was the quality of stillness that expanded from the table outward. Not silence, because the room was still full of noise, but the kind of stillness that happened when people in a localized area all received the same information at the same moment and couldn't process it yet. Sienna watched it happen from 30 feet away. Callum's father was standing with his phone in his hand, and his face had gone the specific gray-white of a man receiving medical news. And the 2 attorneys beside him were leaning in, and the body language of the conversation was no longer advisory. It was emergency management. Then Callum's father sat down hard in his chair, which was not the movement of a man who had chosen to sit. Callum was still standing. He looked at his father. He looked at the attorneys. He looked across the room, not at Sienna, not at Roman, at the ballroom's main exit. And his expression in that moment was the most honest thing she had ever seen on his face. Pure animal calculation. The geometry of escape. Roman's hand closed lightly on her elbow. Stay with me, he said quietly. 4 men had appeared near the ballroom's main entrance. They wore suits, but the suits didn't move the way civilian suits moved. Too structured across the shoulders, too specific a cut around the jacket hem. Federal marshals. They weren't being subtle about it anymore. The room noticed. The ripple moved through the gala crowd with the specific electricity of public scandal. That cocktail of horror and fascination, the thing everyone pretended they didn't want to witness, and then witnessed with complete attention. Conversations fractured. Phones came out. The orchestra, either unaware or committed to the fiction of normalcy, continued playing something in 3/4 time that had become grotesquely inappropriate. Callum's father stood up again. He looked around the room with the wide, searching expression of a man who was not yet accepting the reality that was landing on him, who was still somewhere in the negotiation phase of a crisis that was no longer negotiable. He said something to Callum. Callum shook his head. His father grabbed his arm. Callum pulled free. The same practice speed as before, but this time he didn't just pull free. He stepped away from the table, away from his father, away from the attorneys, and he scanned the room with the quick, darting attention of a man who was looking for leverage. He found Sienna. He was moving toward her before she fully processed it, and she felt Roman's hand shift from her elbow to the small of her back, a change in pressure and intent, and she felt Dario materialize somewhere to her left without having seen him arrive. Callum covered the distance in 15 seconds. He stopped 4 feet from her, and his face was doing 3 things at once: fear, fury, and the desperate arithmetic of a man trying to construct a deal from nothing. "Call him off," he said. "I can't call off federal marshals," she said. "Not them." He looked at Roman. "You know what I'm talking about. There has to be something." He stopped, restarted, pulled himself into a semblance of control. "I'll do whatever you want. A statement retracting the things I said tonight. A donation. Name the number. My father is sick. He's been under pressure. He made decisions." "Your father made his decisions," Roman said. "They're already filed." "There has to be something." "There isn't," Roman said. The flatness of it was worse than anger. It was the flatness of something completely finished. Callum turned back to Sienna with the fractured attention of a man running out of angles. "Sienna." His voice had changed again, stripped of the performance, down to something raw, and for a half-second she almost felt something toward him that wasn't anger, not sympathy, something more complicated, the recognition of a person realizing too late that they have been exactly who they chose to be. "I'm sorry for what I said tonight. I mean that. I know," she said. "Then, it doesn't change anything." She looked at him steadily. "Your apology doesn't open those contracts. It doesn't give those people their wages back. It doesn't undo what your family built." She kept her voice even, not cold. She didn't want to perform coldness, didn't want to give him the theater of cruelty to focus on. Just honest, just the plain geography of what was true. "I'm sorry things turned out this way for you. I mean that too. But you made every choice that got you here, Callum. Every single one." He stood there for a long moment. Then one of the federal marshals arrived at the table, and another appeared beside Callum's father, and the room which had been pretending not to watch entirely abandoned the pretense, and the orchestra finally, mercifully, stopped playing. Callum's father was led out through the main entrance with his hands in front of him and his jaw set in the expression of a man who had decided that dignity was the last thing he could control. His mother, Sienna hadn't known she was in the room until this moment, let out a sound that cut through the ambient noise of 200 people and landed somewhere below language. One of the social photographers caught it. Sienna watched the photographer take the shot and felt something sour move through her that wasn't triumph. She had wanted this. She had wanted Callum to understand the cost of what he'd done. But standing in the actual room while his mother made that sound and his father walked out in handcuffs, she found that the wanting and the having were not the same experience at all. Roman was watching her. "Don't apologize for feeling it," he said quietly. She hadn't said anything. "Feeling what?" "Whatever you're feeling right now. The thing that doesn't look like victory." He looked at the exit where the marshals had gone. "It means you're still a person. That's not a weakness." She didn't respond to that. She wasn't ready to. Callum was still standing near the edge of the dispersing crowd, his phone in his hand. The attorneys clustered around him in the low-voiced urgency of damage control. He looked up and found her eyes once more across the chaos of the room, and the look on his face now was something she had never seen from him before. Not anger, not calculation, just the blank, hollowed look of a man who had finally run out of moves in a game he hadn't realized had started. She looked away first. Roman's phone vibrated. He looked at it, and something changed in the set of his jaw. A tightening, almost imperceptible, but she was standing close enough now to read him better than she had an hour ago. He put the phone away and turned to Dario, who had materialized fully at his left, and they exchanged something wordless. The shorthand of two people who had been operating together long enough to compress information into posture and glance. "We need to move the timeline," Dario said. "I know." "Falcone's people." "I know," Roman said harder. He turned to Sienna, and his face had shifted back into its operational flatness, the particular blankness of a man who had switched registers and didn't have space for anything else. I need you to stay in this room. Dario will stay with you. Don't go near the exits. What's happening? Something I should have anticipated more precisely. He said it without self-recrimination, just the flat acknowledgement of a miscalculation. Stay here. Roman. He stopped. Tell me what's happening, she said. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Outside, beyond the enormous windows, the snow was falling harder now, the city skyline fracturing through the glass into something less legible, less certain. Below, the streets would be white and quiet, or they would appear to be. The East Meridian faction, he said. They've moved earlier than expected. There are people outside this building. A pause. Armed. Sienna's chest did something complicated. The federal presence here should limit their options, he continued. But I have a convoy that needs to move in the next 20 minutes, and the route is compromised. He held her eyes. I'm going to resolve this, but I need you to stay in this building. And if something goes wrong? The question hung between them, honest and specific, and too important to deflect. Roman looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the car, directly, without performance, giving her the full weight of his attention as though she had earned the right to it. Then, he said, Dario gets you out through the kitchen corridor. There's a car waiting on the service side. A pause. The same alley where I found you. She absorbed that. The full circle of it. The fact that he'd planned for failure in the same location he'd planned for everything else. How long have you been planning tonight? She asked. Roman was already moving. At the doorway to the corridor, he paused, half-turned, and said the last thing she expected. Since the night your father saved my life, he said. I just didn't know it would look like this. Then he was gone. Dario shifted to stand slightly in front of her, not blocking her view, but positioned in the way of a person who has placed himself between something valuable and the direction a threat might come from. And the room around them was in full controlled chaos now, guests clustering in uncertain groups, the federal presence creating a gravitational pull of anxiety, phones and whispers, and the specific social paralysis of wealthy people encountering consequences they hadn't scheduled. Sienna looked at the window. The snow was thick enough now that the street below was barely visible, but she could see, dimly, the shapes of vehicles that had not been there an hour ago. Dark vehicles, positioned with the particular deliberateness of things that were not parked but placed. How many? She asked Dario quietly. He was already looking at the window. His jaw was set, and his hand had moved to his jacket in the unconscious gesture of someone checking a weight they expected to find there. Enough, he said. Outside, the city held its breath beneath the falling snow, and somewhere in the white, dark streets below, Roman Castelli was walking towards something that had been building for months, while the clock above the ballroom archway reached 11:58 and kept moving, indifferent as always, toward 11:58 became 11:59 without ceremony. Sienna stood at the window and watched the dark vehicles below and counted them. The way she counted everything when the world got too loud. 1, 2, 3 along the north curb, 2 more at the intersection where Aldermore Street met the financial district's main artery, and 1 she wasn't sure about, partially hidden behind the shadow of a delivery truck that had no business being parked there at this hour. 6. Maybe 7. The snow made the geometry uncertain. Dario was on his phone. He'd moved 8 feet away for the call, close enough that she was still technically within his operational radius, but far enough that she couldn't hear the specific words, only the tone, low, clipped, the specific cadence of someone receiving information they didn't like and processing it without the luxury of reacting. He finished the call and came back and stood beside her and looked at the same window. Roman's outside, he said. I know. He has 6 men with him. She looked at the vehicles below and did the math and said nothing. The ballroom behind them had partially emptied. The federal presence had created a kind of gravitational repulsion, guests finding reasons to remember early commitments, coat check lines forming with sudden urgency. The ones who stayed were either too invested in the spectacle to leave, or the kind of people who understood intuitively that leaving a scene too quickly announced a relationship to it. Helena Marsh was still there. Of course she was. Callum Pierce had not left. He was sitting at this family table now, alone. The attorneys having retreated to a corner for a private conference, his mother having been escorted somewhere quieter by a hotel staff member who'd appeared with the trained sensitivity of someone paid to manage distress. Callum sat with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, and he looked from this distance very young and very tired, and like someone who had just realized that the ground had been a different texture than he'd thought his entire life. And now he was standing on the real ground for the first time, and it was harder. Sienna pulled her attention away from him. The clock turned midnight. There was a mechanical chime from somewhere, the hotel's decorative clock in the lobby, audible even through the walls. And someone in the remaining crowd made a half-hearted noise of celebration that died immediately in the ambient tension of the room. No one popped champagne. No one kissed anyone. The orchestra had packed up. The new year arrived in Blackthorne City's most prestigious ballroom with all the ceremony of a door closing in an empty hallway. Then, from outside, a sound that was not fireworks. It was close enough that Sienna felt it in her sternum before her brain categorized it. A sharp, percussive report that the building's glass and stone partially absorbed but couldn't fully neutralize, followed by two more in quick succession, and then a longer silence that was worse than the sound. The remaining guests understood collectively and instantaneously. The room erupted, not in panic exactly, in the specific controlled chaos of expensive people encountering something their money had always successfully insulated them from, the gap between their theoretical understanding of violence and its actual acoustic reality. People moved toward the interior of the building, away from the windows, and Dario's hand closed on Sienna's arm with a pressure that was firm without being rough. "Kitchen corridor," he said. "Now." "Roman is handling it. Move." She moved. But she was already looking back at the window, and what she saw in the 3 seconds before Dario pulled her away from it was this: one of the dark vehicles on the north curb with its door open, a figure running in a direction that suggested retreat rather than advance, and further down the block, half obscured by snow and distance, two figures that might have been Roman's men, or might have been the other thing, and the particular orange-white flash that came from the direction of the hotel's side entrance, brief and final, that told her this had already moved past the theoretical stage. Dario got her through a service door behind the ballroom stage and into the corridor she knew, the back-of-house artery that connected the ballroom level to the kitchen, the loading dock, and the service elevator bank. Familiar territory. She'd walked this corridor 1,000 times in kitchen whites with burns on her forearms and her hair under a net. It looked different now with the emergency lighting cycling on as the hotel's security system registered the exterior situation, the fluorescent overheads replaced by the lower amber wash of backup power, the corridor reduced to its functional bones. Two of Dario's people were already in the corridor. She hadn't noticed them in the ballroom, which meant they'd been there to not be noticed, which meant Roman had positioned them hours ago, which meant all of this had been architected to a degree she was still only partially seeing. "Car's on the service side," Dario said, moving them forward. 60 seconds. "Is he?" "I don't know yet." They reached the kitchen. Empty. The staff had been evacuated or had evacuated themselves. The overhead lights still on full, every burner cold. The prep stations abandoned mid-task in some cases. A half-chopped onion on the board nearest the door. A stock pot sitting on an inactive burner with a wooden spoon balanced across the rim. The ordinary mid-sentence abandonment of a kitchen that had been interrupted. Sienna felt something strange move through her at the sight of it. A familiarity, an intimacy. The way you felt seeing your own handwriting in a place you hadn't expected to find it. They went through the kitchen and into the loading dock antechamber, and Dario pushed open the heavy door to the service alley. The cold hit her like a physical thing. The dress was not built for this. The crimson silk that had been magnificent under chandeliers was approximately useless against Blackthorne City in January, and the snow that had been scenic from inside was simply wet and cold and immediate out here, melting against her face and bare arms and the back of her neck. The car was there. Black, unmarked, engine running, a man in a dark jacket standing beside the rear door. Not a car she recognized from earlier. A different vehicle, different driver, the contingency Roman had described. The same alley, as promised. She stopped moving. "Get in the car," Dario said. "Where are they taking me?" "Somewhere safe. I'll be right behind you." She looked at him. He was already turning back toward the hotel door, his phone out, his attention dividing between her and whatever was happening on the other side of the building. His face had the specific, focused blankness of someone who had more things to track than he had attention to give them. Dario. She waited until he looked at her. Is he alive? Dario held her eyes for 2 seconds. I don't know yet, he said. The honesty of it was worse and better than reassurance. Get in the car. She got in the car. The driver didn't speak. He moved immediately, pulling out of the alley onto a side street that ran perpendicular to the main frontage, heading away from the sounds that were still occurring. Sporadic, not sustained, which she chose to read as a good sign, though she understood she was making that choice because the alternative was unbearable. The city moved past the windows, snow-blurred, the midnight streets mostly empty, Blackthorne's financial district giving way to the transitional neighborhoods that existed between wealth and everything else. She sat in the back seat in a crimson dress that cost more than her rent, with her hands folded in her lap and her breathing deliberately slow, and counted the blocks as they passed. It took 31 minutes to reach wherever they were going. The building was a converted warehouse in the Kessler district. Not glamorous, but not the kind of place that attracted attention either, which she understood was the point. The driver led her inside through a freight entrance to an upper floor that had been fitted out as functional living space. A kitchen, several rooms behind closed doors, a large central area with industrial windows and mismatched furniture that had the feel of things chosen for utility rather than appearance. 2 men she didn't know were already there. They looked at her without expression and returned to whatever they'd been doing. She sat at the kitchen table and waited. At 1:17 in the morning, her phone rang. Number she didn't recognize. She answered, It's Dario. She closed her eyes. Tell me. He's alive. He took a round in the left shoulder, through and through. He's been treated. A pause. 2 of his men are down. One's in critical at Blackthorne General. The other one is... A brief silence. The other one didn't make it. She pressed her free hand flat against the table. Okay, she said, because she didn't have another word immediately available. The Falcone faction pulled back once the federal presence spilled outside. They didn't plan for that variable. Roman's people are consolidating the perimeter. It's contained for now. For now. For now, he confirmed. He wants to see you when he's able to move. Is he able to move? He'll say he is. The tone told her everything about the difference between those 2 things. Where is he? Dario gave her an address. She wrote it on her hand with a pen she found in the kitchen drawer, in her mother's handwriting. Her mother had taught her to write, had sat with her at a similar table in a similar kitchen in Portside, and guided her hand across paper. And the memory arrived without warning, and she sat with it for a moment before she put the pen down. Dario, she said. Yeah. Who knew about the convoy route? A silence that lasted slightly too long. That's a question Roman's already asking, Dario said carefully. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. She stayed at the Kessler warehouse for 2 more hours because Dario asked her to, and because moving through the city at 2 in the morning in a ball gown was not strategically sensible, and she used the time to do something she was good at. She sat still and she thought. She borrowed a jacket from one of the men, a dark canvas thing that was 3 sizes too large and smelled like gun oil in winter. And she sat at the kitchen table and she went back through the night in sequence, not emotionally, just architecturally, the way she'd learned to go back through a failed dish to find where the process had broken. The convoy route had been compromised. Roman had said the route was compromised before he left, which meant he'd known in the building, which meant the information about the route had been leaked while they were still at the gala. Before midnight, while they were in the ballroom. She thought about who had known the convoy route. Roman's men, Dario, whoever Roman had spoken to in those 3 brief conversations during their circuit of the room. She thought about the timing. Falcone's people had moved earlier than expected, Roman had said. He'd anticipated the attack, but not its exact timing. The early movement suggested they'd received a signal, a go-ahead, a confirmation that the moment was right. Not a scheduled operation, a triggered one. She thought about Callum Pierce sitting at the family table with his face in his hands. She thought about his phone calls, She thought about a man with nothing left to lose who still had information to trade. At 3:40 in the morning, the driver took her across the city to an address in the Westgate neighborhood. Older money than the financial district, quieter, the kind of streets where the buildings had been there long enough to have opinions about the ones around them. A townhouse, 4 stories, dark except for a light in a second-floor window. She was let in by a man she didn't know and taken upstairs to a room that had the functional, transient feel of a place used for recovery rather than living. Roman was sitting up in a chair near the window because, she suspected, he had refused to be in the bed. His left shoulder was heavily bandaged under a clean shirt that someone had helped him put on, and his color was off. Not dramatically, but she'd spent 2 years in a kitchen reading people's physical states at a glance, and she could see the blood loss in the particular quality of his pallor, the way it made him look like a slightly less resolved version of himself. His eyes, though, were the same. Gray and Winter River still and completely present. He looked at her when she came in and said, "You're cold." "I've been cold since I left the hotel." She pulled the borrowed jacket tighter. "You got shot." "Yes." "Are you going to tell me you're fine?" "No, I'm going to tell you it's manageable." He shifted slightly in the chair, and the shift cost him something. She saw it in the brief tightening around his eyes. And then his expression returned to flat. "Sit down." She sat in the chair across from him. The window between them showed the empty street below, snow reduced to a light dusting now, the worst of it past. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that existed between 2 people when something large had just happened and both of them were deciding how to enter it. "Who knew the convoy route?" she said. Roman looked at her for a moment. "I've been sitting here asking that question." "I have a candidate." "So do I," he said. "Tell me yours." "Callum Pierce." She watched his face. He had nothing left after midnight. The arrest, the investigation, his family's name attached to trafficking charges. That's not something you negotiate out of with money anymore. But information is a different currency. If he knew about the convoy, if he'd been investigating your organization, looking for leverage the way a man like that would when he felt cornered, and if Falcone's people approached him at the right moment, he'd sell a route for reduced exposure, Roman said, or for the satisfaction of it. He told me it wasn't over. Roman was quiet for a moment. His right hand, resting on the arm of the chair, was completely still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of someone exerting control over something that wanted to move. Callum Pierce doesn't have the kind of access that would give him convoy route details. No, she agreed, but he might have had access to someone who did. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It had a shape. "Anya Reeve," she said. She'd been sitting with this since the warehouse. Anya Reeve, whose father was a billionaire investor, whose family money ran through half the financial structures that legitimate businessmen used as cover for their less legitimate operations, whose particular position in Blackthorne's economic architecture gave her access to information that traveled through those structures whether she sought it or not. Anya, who had been with Callum, not as a new development, but as an established relationship, not the first time Sienna had understood in the moment behind the curtain, not a new arrangement, but an old one, which meant Callum had been managing both relationships deliberately, which meant there had been a reason to maintain Sienna as a parallel track, a reason that had nothing to do with her. "She's been feeding information to Falcone for how long?" Sienna asked. Roman didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not surprise, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man encountering a mind operating at a speed he hadn't fully accounted for. "We don't know that," he said carefully. "You suspected it." A pause. "There have been irregularities in certain information channels for several months. The source was unclear. And Callum was a way to confirm it." She heard herself say it and felt the room tilt slightly. Not dramatically, just the small vertiginous sensation of a floor revealing itself as lower than you'd thought it was. "That's why you were watching him, not just because of the trafficking, because of his connection to Anya Reeve, because you thought that pipeline was a leak in your organization and you needed to trace it back." Roman said nothing, which was the same as saying yes. She stood up. She wasn't sure why. The room was too small for pacing, but she needed to not be sitting, needed the physical fact of her own uprightness, the simple assertion of her own vertical existence. She moved to the window and looked at the empty street and breathed. "So I was part of the confirmation," she said. "Not accusatory, not yet, just factual, testing the architecture of it. My connection to Callum, the public humiliation, the car, the gala entrance, it made him act. It accelerated his timeline. He was going to approach Falcone eventually, but you needed him to do it tonight, on a schedule you controlled, so you could use the convoy as bait." She turned from the window. "I wasn't collateral. I was the catalyst." The room held the word. Roman sat in the chair with his wounded shoulder and his gray eyes, and he didn't look away from her. He didn't reach for a deflection or a distinction or a carefully measured partial truth. He sat with the question like a man who had decided some time ago that he was done managing this conversation and was simply going to let it arrive. "You were never in danger," he said. "Every contingency was planned," she said. "Yes, the car on the service side, Dario in the ballroom, the Kessler safe house. I understand the logistics." She looked at him. "That's not what I'm asking." "I know what you're asking." "Then answer it." He was quiet for 5 seconds. She counted. "The debt to your father was real," he said. "Everything I told you about your father was true. The protection, the foundation, the hospital subsidies, all of it was real, and none of it was contingent on tonight. But tonight was also useful." "Yes," he said. "Tonight was also useful." She absorbed that, stood at the window of a room in a city that was quiet now, the violence metabolized, the snow settling into its permanent form on the streets below, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was not anger. Anger would have been cleaner, more available, more emotionally legible. What she felt was something closer to the sensation of discovering that the book you'd been reading had more pages than you thought, that the story you understood had a layer beneath it that changed the meaning of what came before without replacing it. "My father saved your life," she said. "And you spent 11 years turning that into an operational advantage." "I spent 11 years honoring a man who deserved better than a 10-minute Union Hall memorial," Roman said. The flatness in his voice had changed. Something had moved in it. Not much, but present. A tectonic shift at the very bottom of the register. "Those two things are not mutually exclusive." "That depends on how you're built," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "it does." She stood at the window a long time. The room was very quiet, and she was aware, beneath everything else, beneath the anger that was present, even if it wasn't the dominant thing, beneath the complicated vertigo of recalibration, beneath the bone-deep exhaustion of a night that had started in a service alley and ended here, she was aware of the specific quality of Roman Castelli's attention. The way he sat injured in a chair and did not perform stoicism at her, or offer managed comfort, or reach for any of the social technologies that people deployed when they wanted to diffuse a conversation they'd lost control of. He just sat and waited, and let her arrive wherever she was going to arrive. It was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. "Tell me about Anya Reeve," she said. "She's been a Falcone conduit for approximately 7 months. We believe she's been passing operational information through a financial intermediary, structured to look like legitimate consulting contracts. Callum's access to her gave him secondary exposure to that channel." Roman shifted slightly in the chair, and again the shift cost him, and again he absorbed the cost without performance. "We needed Callum to make contact with the Falcone side tonight in a verifiable way to confirm the channel and identify the intermediary. The convoy route was information we fed specifically through that channel 3 days ago. The fact that Falcone's people used it tonight confirms the leak." "Where is Anya Reeve right now?" "We don't know." Sienna turned from the window. "What do you mean you don't know?" "She left the gala before midnight, before the federal action, before the shooting." Roman's jaw tightened with something that was not quite anger, but existed in the same neighborhood. "Someone warned her." "Callum. Or someone else. We don't know yet." She thought about the timing. Anya leaving before midnight, before the marshals moved on the Pierce table, before the exterior situation detonated. Not a coincidence, not a lucky read of the room, a warning. Someone had told her the exact moment to disappear. If she's gone, Sienna said slowly, and Callum made contact with Falcone tonight, then Falcone knows the operation was a trap. They know the route was bait. She looked at him. Which means they know you deliberately exposed yourself tonight to identify the leak. Yes. And they know it failed. You're injured, 2 of your men are down, and Anya Reeve is in the wind with whatever she knows about your organization's structure. She paused. Roman, they're going to move again. I know. Soon. Yes. The word landed with a weight that pressed against the room's quiet. She crossed back to the chair and sat down and looked at him directly, the way he'd looked at her in the car, without the social padding, without the softening, just the clean, unobstructed line between one person's eyes and another's. What do you need? She said. Something moved in his face. Not the distant cousin of amusement this time. Something older and less defended. Sienna, I'm not asking because of the debt. I'm not asking because of my father. She held his gaze. I'm asking because I'm here and I have eyes, and whatever you think I am, I'm not someone who walks away from a situation because it got more complicated than expected. She paused. So tell me what you need. Roman looked at her for a long moment. There's a meeting, he said. Tomorrow night. The intermediary, the financial conduit Anya used, is a man named Gregor Vass. He runs a private wealth management firm on the eastern edge of the financial district. He doesn't know we've identified him. He doesn't know the Falcone operation failed tonight. Roman's voice was even, but she could hear, beneath the evenness, the particular strained quality of a man talking through pain he was not acknowledging. If we can get someone into his office building before the meeting, we can access his communication records. Confirm the full scope of the conduit, names, accounts, the complete structure. His building will have security. Significant security, electronic and physical. So you need someone who can move through that building without triggering either. She understood where this was going before she finished saying it. Someone who doesn't look like what they're doing. Someone who looks like they belong in a service capacity, Roman said, in the kitchen of the private dining floor that Vass uses for his client meetings. He held her eyes. Someone with 2 years of documented employment at a Blackthorne luxury hotel who can pass a background check in under 6 hours. Sienna sat with that. The borrowed jacket, the kitchen with its abandoned half-chopped onion, and the stock pot with the wooden spoon balanced across the rim. The way she'd felt walking through that service corridor. The familiarity of it, the intimacy. The thousands of hours that had worn her hands rough and given her the particular invisible competence of someone who knew how to move through spaces without being seen. She thought about the workers in Callum's restaurants, the contracts they couldn't read, the debts they couldn't pay, the structures that people like Gregor Vass built and maintained and called finance. She thought about her father making a choice that wasn't his business because he saw 3 against 1. She thought about Roman's voice saying your father is dead, the debt transfers, and what she understood now that she hadn't understood then, which was that the transfer had never been about obligation. Obligation would have looked like the hospital subsidies, the foundation funding, the quiet management of someone else's life from a respectful distance. The transfer Roman had been carrying for 11 years was something different, something more personal, the specific kind of debt that could only be paid in kind, by seeing clearly, by choosing honestly, by refusing to look away. Okay, she said. You should understand what you're agreeing to. I understand what I'm agreeing to. If Vass's security identifies you, I've worked kitchen shifts at luxury venues for 2 years, she said. I know how to be invisible in a service role. I'm better at it than anyone you have. She held his gaze. And you know that. That's why you're asking. Roman looked at her for a long moment, the injured shoulder, the Winter River eyes, the specific quality of his attention that she was learning to read, the way it shifted when he was being most honest, a barely perceptible softening around the jaw, the slight lessening of the operational flatness that was his default expression in the world. There's something else you should know, he said. His voice had changed, not softer, more careful. She waited. Anya Reeve didn't just leave before midnight. She left with something. He paused. Our security team swept the mezzanine meeting rooms after the building was secured. The room I used tonight, the private briefing I attended before returning to the ballroom, was accessed during the window I was in there. He looked at her steadily. Someone was in that room, Sienna, while we were in the building. Not Anya. She was visible in the ballroom until 11:40. Someone else. Someone from inside your organization. Yes. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. She understood what it meant. Not just a financial conduit, not just an information leak through Anya Reeves' external channel. Someone inside the Castelli operation. Someone who had been in that mezzanine room and had known the precise contents of Roman's briefing and had passed them outward to people who had used them to put two men on the ground and put a round through Roman's shoulder. Dario, she said. Not an accusation, a question. No, Roman said with a certainty that was absolute and didn't require explanation. Not Dario. Then who? He looked at the window, the empty street, the city that had been his for years, the empire built in the dark beneath the glittering surface, the architecture of fear and debt and power that he had constructed brick by brick since before she was old enough to understand what bricklaying meant. He looked tired for the first time. Not the tiredness of blood loss, though that was present. Something older. The specific exhaustion of a man who has been holding something together by force of will for a very long time and has just discovered that the thing has a crack in it he didn't put there. I need you to get into that building tomorrow, he said, and I need you to do it while I find out who was in that room. And if you find out while I'm inside Vass's building? Roman looked back at her from the window. His jaw was set. Then the situation becomes considerably more complicated, he said, than either of us planned. She slept 3 hours on a cot in one of the Westgate townhouse's back rooms and woke before anyone came to wake her, which was how she'd always operated. Some internal mechanism that had never learned to trust that rest would be permitted long enough to complete itself. The borrowed jacket was still around her shoulders. The crimson dress had been replaced at some point in the night by clothes someone had left folded on the chair beside the cot. Dark jeans, a gray thermal, boots that were close enough to her size to function. She put them on without questioning where they'd come from and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was operational. Someone had made coffee, real coffee, not the institutional swill of hotel break rooms, something that smelled like it had been ground in the last hour. She poured a cup and stood at the counter and drank it, while the city outside the window assembled itself in the gray January morning light, Blackthorne coming back to consciousness after the worst night it had experienced in recent memory. The news already running on the small wall-mounted screen in the corner with the volume low. Pierce family arrest, federal corruption sweep, New Year's Eve gala, the footage on a loop, a clip of Callum's father being walked out in handcuffs that had clearly come from one of the social photographers, already edited and packaged and distributed with the seamless speed of modern catastrophe. She turned the screen off and drank her coffee and thought about Gregor Vass. Dario arrived at 7:15 with 2 other men in a folder, and he looked like someone who had not slept, which she suspected was accurate, and he put the folder on the kitchen table and opened it without preamble. Floor plans, security rotation schedules, staff manifests for the private dining level, a photograph of Vass, mid-60s, compact, the kind of face that had once been handsome and had settled into shrewd, with eyes that sat too close together in a way that might have been coincidence or might have been character. 14 floors, Dario said. Private dining is on 12. Vass uses it for client meetings twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday. Today is Thursday. His meeting is at 7 this evening. He looked at her. The building's regular catering vendor is Aldermore Grand's off-site division. She understood immediately. You've been a client of the building. The Castelli organization maintains 3 legitimate corporate entities that use that dining floor regularly. We have an existing vendor relationship with building management. He tapped the staff manifest. The regular crew is 3 people. We need to insert a 4th, a prep assistant brought in for a larger booking. The booking is already in the system as of this morning. Who made the booking? One of our corporate shells 2 months ago. He looked at her. We didn't know we'd need it for this, but we keep options open. She studied the floor plans. The service elevator ran from the basement loading dock to a dedicated service corridor on 12, separate from the main elevator bank. The private dining room sat at the north end of the floor. Vass's private office, where the communication terminals and the physical files would be, was 3 doors down the service corridor, accessed from the main hallway on the east side of the building. "The office access," she said. "How?" Dario slid a small card across the table. It looked like a standard building access card, slightly different color coding than the ones she'd used at the Aldermore Grand, but the same basic architecture. "Master access for service-level staff. Got us the right frequency this morning from building management." He paused. "Took some negotiation." She didn't ask what kind. "I need 45 seconds alone in that office," she said. "Maybe less if the terminals are already active." "The device is already in the kit." He indicated a black nylon bag near the kitchen door. "Plug it into any active terminal port. It extracts automatically. 30 seconds, then you pull it. Small enough to carry in a jacket pocket." He looked at her steadily. "You go in as staff. You do the prep work. You wait for the right window. You go to the office and come back. You finish the shift. And if someone's in the office, Voss's assistant leaves at 6:30. Meeting doesn't start until 7. The window is the 30 minutes in between. And if something changes..." Dario looked at her with the particular expression of someone who understood that contingency planning only went so far and that beyond a certain point you were just describing the shape of your own uncertainty. "Then you improvise," he said. She nodded once and pulled the folder closer and spent the next 2 hours memorizing it. Roman was not in the townhouse when she looked for him at 9. Dario told her he'd been moved to a more secure location, not evasively, but with the specific economy of someone who understood that more information wasn't always more useful and that her question was about whether he was alive and ambulatory rather than about his precise coordinates. He was. That was sufficient. She dressed for the kitchen the way she'd dressed for thousands of kitchen shifts, practically, without sentiment, the way you dressed for work that was going to be physical and hot and relentless. She pulled her hair back and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and thought about the woman in the gala dressing room mirror less than 12 hours ago, the one in the crimson dress, the one without the careful invisibility she'd been wearing so long, she'd mistaken it for skin. She pulled the invisibility back on now, deliberately, not as a retreat, as a tool. She looked like a prep cook. She looked like someone who belonged in a service corridor. She looked like no one anyone would remember. Good. Dario drove her to within 2 blocks of the vast building at 4 in the afternoon, early enough for a prep call on a 7 o'clock service. The building was on Callaway East, a glass and steel structure from the early 2000s, not the oldest or newest thing in the financial district, the kind of building that had enough money in its infrastructure to be taken seriously and enough anonymity in its exterior to avoid being noticed. She walked the 2 blocks alone, her nylon bag over one shoulder, and she went in through the loading dock entrance where the building's facilities manager, a tired-looking man named Osterhoff, who had clearly been doing this job for too long to be interested in new faces, checked her temporary vendor pass and waved her through without looking up from his desk. The service elevator to 12 smelled like industrial cleaner and old food. She rode it with a cart of prep supplies and counted the floors. The kitchen on 12 was smaller than the Aldermore Grand's ballroom kitchen, but organized with the specific, efficient logic of a space designed for intimate, high-stakes service. The kind of cooking where 12 covers mattered more than 200 and where the margins for error were correspondingly tighter. The other 3 crew members were already there. A woman named Bet, who ran the kitchen with the abbreviated authority of someone who'd been doing it long enough to have opinions. A young man in his early 20s named Theo, who moved around the prep stations with the anxious efficiency of someone still learning how to be trusted, and an older man named Curran, who did the cold work and spoke approximately 8 words during the 4 hours she was in the kitchen, all of them work-related. Bet looked her over once. "You're the add-on for the Castelli booking." "Yes." "You have your serve safe." "Valid through next year." Bet looked at her hands, the scars, the calluses, the specific topography of years of kitchen work. She nodded, apparently satisfied that whatever Sienna was, she wasn't a civilian. "Vass likes the duck reduced longer than the spec says. Don't let Theo tell you otherwise." Noted. She worked. That was the thing about kitchens. They were clarifying environments, spaces that reduced everything to the immediate and the physical, that didn't have room for the abstract or the theoretical. She broke down protein and managed temperatures and moved around the space with the automatic competence of years of practice. And while her hands worked, her mind stayed on the clock, on the corridor 3 doors down from the service entrance, on the specific weight of the device in her jacket pocket. At 5:47, Theo burned the first sauce reduction, and Bet's response was volcanic and brief and entirely focused. And while everyone's attention was on the burned pan, Sienna confirmed the corridor was empty and noted the position of the security camera at the hallway junction. Angle and rotation, 4-second cycle, a blind spot every 14 seconds at the far end of the corridor where the camera's arc didn't fully reach the office door. At 6:12, she checked the access card in her pocket. At 6:29, Bet sent Curran to the storage room on 11 for backup stock. At 6:31, Vass's assistant, a young woman in a good suit who looked permanently exhausted, passed through the service corridor on her way to the main elevator and did not look at the kitchen. Sienna clocked her exit time. She gave it 3 minutes. "I need the herb cart from the cold corridor," she told Theo. He started to move, and she said, "I've got it," with the particular tone of someone indicating that this was not an offer, and she went through the service door into the corridor. The cold hit her the same way the alley had hit her last night. Immediate, clarifying. The corridor was empty. Camera at the junction, 4-second cycle. She moved to the wall and counted the rotation, and when the blind spot opened, she covered the last 20 feet to the office door in a controlled walk, not a run. Running triggered peripheral attention, walking was invisible, and she put the access card against the reader. Green light. The door opened. Vass's private office was what she'd expected. Organized, expensive, the kind of space that communicated serious purpose without ostentation. A desk, 2 terminals, a credenza with physical files and labeled folders. One terminal was active, screen locked, but the processor running, the small indicator light steady green. She crossed to it, pulled the device from her pocket, found the port on the back of the tower, and inserted it. 30 seconds. She counted. The device was small and matte black, and it sat in the port doing whatever it did without indication. No light, no sound, just the implicit fact of its operation that she had to trust because she had no way of verifying it, which was a specific kind of discomfort she was learning to operate through. At 28 seconds, she heard something from the corridor. Footsteps, the particular weight and cadence of a deliberate approach, not the soft shuffle of service staff. And at 30 seconds exactly, she pulled the device and pocketed it and moved to the credenza because she needed to be doing something when the door opened, and the credenza was the most plausible destination. The door opened. Gregor Vass was not supposed to arrive until 7. He was here at 6:38, and he stopped in the doorway of his own office and looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has found something in a place it shouldn't be, and whose first response is not alarm, but assessment. The expression of someone who deals in information and is accustomed to treating unexpected data as a problem to be analyzed rather than a threat to be fled from. "The kitchen sent you," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a test. "Chef asked me to check the credenza stock," she said. "For the service." She held up the inventory clipboard she'd taken from the kitchen. She'd palmed it going out the service door, the automatic preparation of someone who understood that props mattered. "We're short on the special reserve settings." Vass looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the credenza. Then he looked at her face again. "Name," he said. "Sarah Venn," she said. The name on the temporary vendor pass. He crossed to his desk and sat down and woke the terminal, and she watched his eyes move across the screen, and she kept her expression professionally neutral, and her breathing slow, and she thought about the device in her pocket, and whether 30 seconds had been enough, and whether the terminal had been active long enough to contain what Roman needed. "The Castelli booking," Vass said. He was looking at the screen. 12 covers. "Yes, sir." "They added a prep assistant last minute." The booking size increased. He looked at her. "You've worked the Castelli account before?" "First time at this venue," she said. "Technically true." Something moved in his face. Not suspicion. She would have recognized suspicion. She'd been reading faces across prep stations and service corridors for years. This was something else. A careful, lateral intelligence. The expression of a man running a parallel calculation while conducting a surface conversation. "Tell Chef Bet the duck can go at 6:50. he said. I moved the start time. Of course. She noted the credenza and turned toward the door. Miss Venn. She stopped. Her back was to him. She took a breath that she did not let be audible and turned back. Vas was holding a phone. He looked at her with those too close eyes, and the lateral intelligence in his face had settled into something more specific, less exploratory. You have something in your left jacket pocket, he said. That's creating a slightly different silhouette than the right side. The room held still. She said nothing for 2 seconds. Long enough to confirm that the silence itself was a kind of answer, that the window for a convincing denial had already closed. Then she said, You should call whoever you're about to call before you decide to. Vas's thumb moved to the phone screen. Because, she said, if you make that call, the people on the other end of it are going to tell you that your account at Reeve Caldwell Financial has been flagged by federal investigators as of this morning. She watched his face. The thumb stopped. And they're going to tell you that Anya Reeve was taken into federal custody at 4:15 this afternoon at a property in the Meridian Coast. She kept her voice even, the same voice she used when a kitchen was on fire and she needed people to move without panicking. And they're going to tell you that the man you've been passing information to, the Falcone organization, suffered significant operational losses last night and is currently in the process of consolidating, which means they are not in a position to protect you from anything in the immediate term. Vas sat very still. Is any of that inaccurate? She asked. He lowered the phone. She breathed. What do you want? He said. Not angry, just the direct, stripped-down question of a man who had reached the part of a situation where negotiation was the only remaining move. Nothing from you tonight, she said. The device already has what we need. What you do with the next 48 hours is your own decision. She held his eyes. But if you're considering your options, the people who are currently most interested in finding you are not Roman Castelli. She left the office and walked back down the corridor without looking behind her, hit the camera blind spot at the right moment, pushed through the service door and returned the inventory clipboard to its hook beside the cold storage entrance with the specific practice motion of someone completing a routine task. Theo looked up. Find what you needed? Close enough, she said. She finished the shift, plated the duck at 6:52, managed the timing on the sides, ran service with Bet and Theo and the mostly silent Curran for 90 minutes while 12 of Blackthorne's financial elite ate and talked and performed the social theater of serious money. Vas sat at the head of his table and conducted his meeting and did not look toward the kitchen, and she watched him through the service window in the intervals between plates, and she could see, in the set of his shoulders and the particular quality of his stillness, a man running internal calculations of a very urgent kind. She left the building at 9:15 with the device in her pocket and walked 2 blocks to the car Dario had waiting and got in without speaking, and the city moved past the windows in its nighttime configuration. Lights and wet streets and the specific Blackthorne darkness that was never fully dark because the money that ran through this city generated its own illumination. And she sat with her hands folded in her lap and felt the specific physical aftermath of extended controlled adrenaline, the way it settled into the body as something between exhaustion and clarity. Dario was in the passenger seat. He turned to look at her when she got in, and she held up the device and he took it, and his expression did something brief and relieved. Anya Reeve, she said. You took her this afternoon. 4:15, Meridian Coast property, registered to a shell company. He turned the device over in his hands. She came with us voluntarily, which tells you something about her current threat assessment of the Falcone organization. She's going to cooperate. She's already cooperating, which is why Roman needed this, he indicated the device, to cross-reference. He wants the complete financial architecture before he approaches the federal team with the Falcone information. If the accounts don't align, the case falls apart. He looked at her. You got it. 30 seconds, she said. The terminal was active. Then we have everything. She nodded, looked out the window. The city moved. Vas made me, she said. Dario's expression sharpened. How bad? Managed. He's calculating his options. I gave him enough information about his current exposure to make the Falcone option look considerably less attractive. She paused. He won't run tonight. He's too careful. He'll want to verify everything I told him before he moves, and verification takes time, and by the time he's finished verifying, we won't need him to stay put anymore." Dario looked at her for a moment. "That was not in the plan." "No," she agreed. "It was the improvisation." He was quiet for a second. Then something moved in his face that might, on a different kind of face, have been called admiration. "Roman needs to see you," he said. "Now." The secure location was a property in the West Haven district. A different building from the Westgate townhouse, different neighborhood, different architecture. Same functional aesthetic of a space chosen for operational purpose over comfort. She was taken to a room on the 3rd floor, and Roman was there. He was standing this time. He looked like a man who had been told by several people that he should not be standing and had considered their opinions and decided against incorporating them. The shoulder was bandaged under a dark sweater, and his color was still off, but his eyes were the same Winter River gray and completely present, and when she walked in, he looked at her with the full, unfiltered attention she was learning to recognize as the most honest version of him. "You have it," he said. She handed him the device. He held it for a moment without looking at it. Looking at her instead, and she understood he was doing what she'd done in the kitchen. Reading the physical evidence, the tiredness, the specific tension around the eyes, the hands. "Vas made you," he said. "Dario told you." "Dario told me 30 seconds ago. Tell me what happened." She told him. All of it, precisely, in sequence, the way she'd been trained to recount kitchen incidents. What happened, when, in what order, what she did about it. He listened without interrupting, and his expression moved through several configurations she was learning to read, and when she finished, there was a silence. "You told him about Anya Reeve," he said. "Yes. That wasn't information you were supposed to have. I overheard it this morning. I retained things." She held his eyes. "It was the right call. He was going to make the call, and the call was going to compromise your timeline with the federal team." Roman looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "It was the right call." He set the device on the table beside him and looked at it. "This gives us the Falcone financial structure, full account architecture, the intermediary chain, the operational funding sources. We have Anya Reeve's testimony. We have the communication records from the convoy operation." He looked up. "The federal prosecutor can move on the Falcone organization within 48 hours. And the person inside your organization." The room changed. Not physically. The light was the same, the temperature was the same, but the specific quality of Roman's stillness shifted into something she recognized from the gala, from the moment before the federal marshals moved on the Pierce table, the stillness of a man standing on the far side of a decision already made. "We know who it was," he said. She waited. "His name is Renko. He's been with the organization for 6 years. He was in the mezzanine room because he had a legitimate operational reason to be there." Roman's jaw was set. "He was passed to Falcone through Anya Reeve's network approximately 4 months ago, turned with a combination of financial pressure and a threat to his family." A pause. "His daughter." She absorbed that. The geometry of coercion, the specific way that pressure found the load-bearing walls of a person's life and leaned on them until something gave. "Where is he now?" "Here," Roman said. She went still. "In this building," he said. "He doesn't know we know. He's been here since this morning operating normally, which means the information he's been passing since this morning has been information we've controlled." A pause. "He passed our location to a Falcone contact at 2:17 this afternoon." She understood what that meant. She felt it land in the center of her chest with the specific weight of something inevitable. "They know where we are," she said. "Yes." "Right now." "Yes." Roman's voice was steady. "And they're coming." Outside, in the wet West Haven street, a car engine that had been idling for the last 4 minutes cut off. Then another. Dario appeared in the doorway with his jacket open and his eyes moving, and he said one word. "Now." Roman reached under the table and came up with something he tucked into the back of his waistband with the practiced economy of a man for whom this was not a new configuration, and he moved toward the door, and Sienna was already moving with him, because standing still was not an option her body was going to permit. And in the corridor outside the room, there were voices and footsteps, and the building's lights did something strange. A flicker, half a second, the specific electrical hiccup of an exterior power interruption. And then the lights came back, and in the new configuration of the corridor, she saw Renko. He was standing at the far end of the hallway. He had a phone in his hand, and he was looking at Roman with the expression of a man who has been caught in the precise moment of the thing he's been caught doing. The expression that contained simultaneously the calculation of remaining options and the sick animal recognition that the options are gone. Roman stopped. The corridor held them all. "My daughter," Renko said. His voice was not steady, not asking forgiveness. Past that. Just naming the reason the way you named a wound because it was the only honest thing left. "They have my daughter." "I know," Roman said. "She's 17. "I know," Roman said again, the same way. Renko's hand tightened on the phone. His eyes moved to Dario, to the two men behind Dario, to Sienna, to Roman, and back to Roman, and the calculation in his face resolved itself into something that was not quite despair and not quite decision, and lived in the narrow, terrible space between them. "They're already inside the building," he said. "Ground floor, 6 men. I gave them the layout." "I know that too," Roman said. From below the sound of the stairwell door, Roman looked at Sienna, and his expression was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on his face. Not fear, not the cold operational assessment, but something that existed in the space between instruction and something older and less nameable. The look of a man who was about to do something that had already been decided, and was simply acknowledging the last moment before it happened. "Kitchen corridor," he said. "Same as last night. There is no kitchen corridor here. Service stairs, east end of the hall. Dario has the route." "Roman, Sienna." Her name in his mouth, the specific weight of it. "There are 6 men on that stairwell, and I have 4, and Renko has already told them the layout. The math requires—" "I know what the math requires," she said. From the stairwell, closer now. A door opening. Boots on concrete. Dario's hand on her arm. "We have to move." She looked at Roman, the wounded shoulder, the Winter River eyes that were not asking her for anything, that were simply looking at her with the particular quality of a person who has spent years paying debts and has reached the last one and is simply standing in front of it with both hands open. She thought about her father. 3 against 1, a choice that wasn't his business. "I'm not going," she said. Dario's grip tightened. "Sienna, I am not going," she said again, and her voice was the same voice from the office, from the confrontation with Callum, from the alley and the car and the gala staircase, the voice of a person who had stopped apologizing for taking up space, and she pulled her arm free from Dario's grip, and she turned to face the end of the corridor where the stairwell door was swinging open and the first shape was coming through it, and Roman made a sound behind her that might have been her name or might have been something beyond language. And the corridor erupted into, the first man through the stairwell door was large and moving fast, and he did not expect anyone to be standing in the corridor because the intelligence he'd been given said the corridor would be clear by the time they reached it. Sienna was not clear. She was standing 8 feet from the stairwell door with her weight forward and her hands loose at her sides, and she had approximately 1 second to make a decision that her body made before her mind finished framing the question. She stepped into his path instead of away from it. Into, which was wrong by every instinct except the one that understood that the man behind her had a wounded shoulder and 4 men against 6, and that the geometry of this corridor required someone to occupy its mouth for long enough to change the arithmetic. The collision was not elegant. It was 2 bodies at incompatible velocities meeting in a narrow space, and the impact drove the air out of her in a single hard grunt. And she went into the wall and her shoulder hit the plaster and something flared bright and immediate up her arm. And the man stumbled but didn't go down, which she had not expected, and he grabbed her jacket with one hand and she was already moving again, ducking under the grab and shoving him sideways with both palms against his chest, putting her whole weight behind it, because she had been carrying heavy stock pots and moving full sheet trays and hauling delivery orders since she was 16, and her hands were not soft and her core was not weak, and the man was larger than her, but he had been expecting an empty corridor, and she had been expecting him. He went into the opposite wall. Behind him, the second man was already through the door. Then Roman was beside her. She didn't see him arrive. He was simply there. And what happened in the next 40 seconds was something she experienced in fragments rather than sequence. The way extreme physical events always fragmented time, the specific sound of impact, close and percussive, Dario's voice from somewhere down the corridor, sharp and instructional. The cold air from the stairwell door still swinging, Roman's elbow against her shoulder as he moved past her, and the brief pressure of that contact that told her he was real and upright and moving. The second man going down hard and not getting up, the third man hesitating at the doorway, which was the first tactical mistake that any of them had made, and the hesitation cost him the half-second that Dario needed. Then it was 4 against 4 because 2 of the 6 were already accounted for, and the corridor was too narrow for the remaining men to use their numerical advantage effectively, which she understood Roman had known when he positioned himself at the corridor's mouth rather than retreating toward the east stairs. He'd turned the architecture into an equalizer. 6 men in a wide room was a different problem than 6 men feeding through a single doorway one at a time into a corridor occupied by people who were already there and already moving. She was not standing still. She was not a combatant in any formal sense. She had no training, no prepared technique, nothing except the specific physical competence of a person who had been managing difficult spaces and difficult bodies for years. And the knowledge that standing still in the middle of a corridor fight was the only option worse than being in one. She stayed to the wall and she moved when movement was necessary, and she watched the geometry with the same attention she gave a kitchen at full service. Tracking positions, tracking what was about to collide, staying out of the way of things that would knock her over and into the way of things she could affect. The fourth man got past Roman. He came toward her fast, and she had perhaps a heartbeat of warning, and she did not have time to be afraid because fear required a kind of temporal spaciousness that the situation wasn't providing, and she grabbed the fire extinguisher bracketed to the wall beside her. She'd registered it when she came down the corridor 10 minutes ago. The automatic inventory of someone who spent years learning what every kitchen wall contained at every point, and she swung it two-handed. It connected with the man's forearm as he reached for her. She heard something she did not want to name. He made a sound and dropped, and she kept the extinguisher in her hands because it was the only thing she had. Then it was over. Not cleanly, not quickly. Over in the way that physical confrontations ended, not a dramatic conclusion, but a cessation. The specific moment when the energy that had been sustaining the chaos ran out, and the corridor simply contained people in various states of damage instead of people in motion. 4 of Falcone's 6 men were down or against walls. The other 2 had retreated back through the stairwell door, which told her they'd reached a calculation about the cost-benefit of continuing that came out on the wrong side. Silence. Her shoulder was burning, her hands were shaking, not fear, the specific adrenaline tremor that arrived after, rather than during, the body catching up with what it had just done. She was breathing through her mouth in short, effortful pulls, and she could feel her pulse in her temples, and in the palms of her hands, and in the sole of her left foot. For some reason she couldn't explain. Roman was standing 6 feet away. He was upright. His left arm was held slightly away from his body, the wounded shoulder compensating, the bandaging holding, but the movement of the last 40 seconds had cost something that was visible in his color and in the set of his jaw. He was looking at her, not at the men on the floor, at her. "You said you were going," he said. His voice was controlled but had a roughness in it she hadn't heard before. "I said I wasn't going," she said. She set the fire extinguisher down against the wall. Her arms were shaking too now. "I told you to go." "You told me about the math." She looked at him steadily. The math was wrong. He held her eyes for a long moment. Then something in his face did what it very rarely did. It opened. Not much. The equivalent of a door cracked an inch rather than swung wide. But it was there, and she recognized it for what it was because she had the same door in herself, and she knew exactly how much it cost to crack it. Dario appeared between them with the specific, pragmatic urgency of a man who understood that the emotional accounting could happen later. "We need to move. The 2 who retreated are going to regroup, and they'll call for backup, and we have maybe 8 minutes before this building has more company." They moved. Renko was still in the corridor. He'd pressed himself to the wall during the fight, and he was there now, standing in the specific stillness of a man who has watched something happen that he caused, and is absorbing the weight of the causation in real time. He was not trying to run. His hands were at his sides and his face had the hollow quality of someone who has arrived at the bottom of something. Roman stopped in front of him. The two men looked at each other in the amber backup lighting, and Sienna watched from 3 feet away and tried to read what moved between them. The 6 years of shared operational history, the specific betrayal, the daughter, the coercion, all of it compressed into a 10-second silence that contained more actual communication than most conversations managed in an hour. "My daughter," Renko said again. "She's safe," Roman said. "She's been safe since 8 this morning. We moved her before you were aware we knew." Renko's face broke. Not dramatically, not the theatrical collapse of film betrayal scenes, but something much smaller and much more real, a single visible flinch, a fractional loosening around the mouth and eyes, the specific involuntary physical expression of a person who has been holding something enormous in place by pure tension and has just been told they can stop. "You knew this morning," Renko said. "Yes. And you passed controlled information," Roman said. "Everything you gave Falcone today was information I wanted them to have. The location, the timeline. I needed them to commit their people to this building tonight." A pause. "You helped me finish it." Renko stood with that. Sienna watched him absorb it. The specific moral complexity of discovering that your betrayal had been metabolized into someone else's strategy, that the thing you'd done out of desperation had been turned around and used against the people you'd done it for without your knowledge. It wasn't redemption exactly. It was something more uncomfortable than redemption, something that would take considerably longer to process. "What happens now?" Renko said. "Now you come with us," Roman said, "and then we have a long conversation." He looked at the older man with the flat, direct attention that didn't perform mercy but contained it somewhere underneath. "Your daughter needs her father. Keep that in mind during the conversation." They went out through the East Service stairs, into a back street, into 2 cars that Dario had staged, and the city swallowed them. The federal prosecutor's name was Adelman, and she met with Roman at 6 in the morning in a conference room in a building that was deliberately unremarkable, and in a part of the city where unremarkable buildings were not unusual. Sienna sat in a chair along the wall and watched the meeting happen, which Roman had asked her to attend without explanation, and which she had attended for the same reason she'd been making most of her decisions for the last 24 hours. Because the alternative was standing outside the room while things that affected her life were decided by people inside it, and she was done with that particular configuration. Adelman was in her mid-40s, compact and precise, with the specific manner of someone who had spent years in rooms where people lied to her and had developed an extremely efficient process for identifying when that was happening. She looked at Sienna once when she came in, and then looked at Roman, and after that conducted the meeting as if Sienna was simply part of the architecture, which Sienna found she preferred to being narrated at. The device from Vass's terminal had given them the complete financial structure of the Falcone organization's funding chain: 17 shell accounts across 4 jurisdictions, 3 legitimate business fronts that had been processing operational money for 6 years, and the names of 11 individuals in Blackthorne's financial and legal community who had been providing cover services in exchange for specific and documented considerations. Anya Reeves' testimony corroborated the account architecture and added the communication records that established Falcone's operational decision-making chain. Renko's statement, given at 3 in the morning in a room with Roman and Dario and a recording device, in the specific exhausted honesty of a man who had run out of reasons to hold anything back, closed the last gaps. Adelman looked at the material for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "This is sufficient." Roman said, "I know. The Falcone organization has been operating in Blackthorne for 11 years. This ends it." "Yes." Adelman looked at him with the particular expression of a federal prosecutor in the presence of a man who had just handed her the most significant organized crime case of her career while being himself a subject of 3 separate ongoing federal investigations. The expression contained several things at once: professional satisfaction, personal ambivalence, the specific discomfort of a legal architecture that didn't have clean categories for what was sitting across the table from her. "The Castelli organization," she said carefully. is not what it was 11 years ago, Roman said. Or 6, or 2. He held her eyes. You have what you need. The conversation about everything else can happen on a different timeline. Adelman looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Sienna, with the attention she'd been withholding since the beginning of the meeting, the direct assessing look of someone finally deciding to take a reading. The workers in the Pierce Corporation, Sienna said, before Adelman could direct anything at her. 47 individuals currently holding debt bondage contracts. The contracts were structured through a legal firm called Harwick & Souls. You'll find them in the vast materials. The workers need immunity from any immigration-related charges that the investigation might otherwise generate, and they need the debt instruments voided. She held Adelman's eyes. That's the conversation I want to have, today, before anything else moves forward. Adelman's expression shifted into something that might have been respect, if federal prosecutors allowed themselves that particular expression in professional settings. Those decisions involve multiple agencies, she said. I understand that. I'm telling you what needs to happen. Sienna kept her voice even. You have 11 years of Falcone material on that table. You have the Pierce trafficking case. You have Anya Reeves' testimony and Vass's financial records. You have everything you need for the most significant corruption prosecution this city has seen in 2 decades. She paused. 47 people need to go home without being prosecuted for surviving. That's not a complex ask. Adelman looked at the material on the table. Then she looked at Roman. Then she looked back at Sienna. I'll make the calls, she said. They left the building at 7:40 in the morning into a city that was white and cold and sharp-edged with new January light. The sky the specific pale gray of a winter morning that was not quite ready to commit to anything, and Sienna stood on the pavement outside and breathed the cold air and felt the specific total exhaustion of a body that had been running on adrenaline and necessity for 36 hours and had now run out of both and was simply standing in the aftermath, waiting to understand what came next. Roman stood beside her. His shoulder was bandaged under a new jacket that Dario had produced from somewhere, and his color was still not right, but he was upright and present, and the Winter River eyes were the same as they'd always been. They stood there for a moment without speaking. The city moved around them. Early morning traffic, a delivery truck, a woman walking a dog with the particular focused purposefulness of someone who had somewhere to be. The ordinary metabolism of a city that had survived its own night and was simply continuing. Anya Reeve, Sienna said finally. Federal custody. She'll cooperate fully for reduced exposure. She doesn't have the stomach for what comes after betraying the Falcone organization, and she knows it. Vass turned himself in to Adelman's office at midnight. He'd made his calculations. Roman paused. You told him enough to make the right choice look like the only choice. He took it. Renko's daughter. She's with him. She'll stay with him. He said it with the flatness that meant the matter was closed in a direction that cost him something. Not financially, the other kind. She looked at the street, at the light on the buildings across from them, the way January sun hit glass and concrete and made everything look simultaneously fragile and permanent. The man who didn't make it, she said, from the night before. Your man. Carver. Roman said the name with the specific weight of someone for whom names were not abstract. 31. He had a sister in the Portside district. A pause. I've already spoken with her. Sienna nodded. They stood in the cold, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of 2 people who had been through something together and were standing on the far side of it and finding that the far side was simply more ground. Not a destination, not a resolution in the cinematic sense, just the next stretch of territory to be crossed. What happens to your organization, she said, after Adelman? Change, Roman said, the kind that's been coming for a long time. He looked at the street. The leverage I've held over certain elements of this city, political, financial, it gets handed over in a managed way. Not all of it. Not immediately. The pieces that were built on what Falcone was, and what the Pierce organization was, and what Vass was facilitating, those get dismantled. He paused. The pieces that were built on something else can stand. Something else meaning what? Meaning the dock workers who needed protection when the shipping companies were running unregistered safety violations. The restaurant staff who needed someone to call when management was skimming wages, the neighborhoods that the city government decided weren't worth maintaining. He looked at her. Not all of it was what you think it was. I know, she said. I never thought it was. He looked at her. My father made a choice in a dockside fight, she said, not because he knew who you were, because of what he saw. She held his gaze. I've been trying to understand what he saw. I think I understand it better now. Roman was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the roughness that she'd heard in the corridor, and that she now understood was the sound of something that didn't normally get to be audible. He saw someone worth choosing, Roman said. Maybe, she said, or maybe he just saw the math and decided to change it. Something moved in his face. The door cracked further than it had in the corridor, further than she'd seen it open in 36 hours of watching him manage himself against a world that had apparently been trying to take things from him for a very long time. I want to show you something, he said. They drove to port side. She knew where they were going before the car reached the harbor, recognized the streets in the specific cellular way of someone whose childhood had been organized around certain corners and certain smells and the particular quality of light that came off water in January. The docks were quiet this early, the overnight shift just ending, the day crew not yet arrived, the long harbor basin gray and still beneath the winter sky. Roman had the driver stop on Crane Street at the intersection where the old South Dock access road met the main harbor causeway. She knew this intersection. She had ridden her bicycle through it at age 7, at age 10, at age 12, in the months before her father died. She knew the pothole near the east curb that never got repaired, and the way the streetlight on the corner cast a shadow shaped like a bent arm, and the smell of salt and diesel that had been the smell of her father coming home. Here, Roman said. She got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the intersection. In the early morning light, it was simply a working harbor corner, weathered asphalt, a chain-link fence running along the dock access road, the water visible beyond it. The kind of place that didn't ask to be looked at, that had simply been continuing its existence regardless of whether anyone noticed. This is where it happened, she said. Not a question. August 15th, 11 years ago. He stood beside her. I've come back here several times. Not... He stopped. Started again. Not for any productive reason. Just to stand here. She looked at the intersection, at the chain-link fence and the gray water and the bent arm shadow of the streetlight that was fainter now in the morning light but still present. He would have liked you, she said. He had no patience for people who didn't say what they meant, but he liked people who did hard things without making a performance of it. She looked at the water. You never told anyone. 11 years and you never told anyone what he did. There was no one to tell, Roman said. His family didn't need to know what I was, and the people I worked with... He paused. A debt like that doesn't mean anything to people who keep score in different units. It meant something to you. Yes. She looked at him. The January light was thin and cold, and it hit the angles of his face without flattery, showing the tiredness and the injury and the specific worn quality of a man who had been holding something for 11 years and had just set it down. He looked like a person, not an empire, not a symbol, not the most feared man in Blackthorne City, just a person standing on a harbor corner in the early morning, looking slightly hollowed by the effort of having done something difficult and arrived at its end. She thought about her father, about a man who had come home smelling like salt and diesel, and had sat at their kitchen table and asked her what she'd learned that day, every day, without fail, with the specific attention of a person who understood that what his daughter was learning was the most important project either of them was working on. She thought about his hands, rough and scarred like hers. She thought about the fact that he had stood on this corner and made a choice that she was still living inside, 11 years later, in a city that had tried several times in the last 2 days to arrive at a different ending. Thank you, she said. Roman looked at her. For what? For not letting it be just a story. She held his gaze. For making it something that kept moving after he was gone. He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. Some things didn't have an answer that was adequate to them, and it was better to understand that than to put something inadequate in the space. They stood at the intersection for a while longer, the city waking up around them, the harbor beginning its daily operations with the indifferent efficiency of industry that did not pause for the private reckonings of the people who worked near it. A cargo crane on the far pier began its morning cycle. A tugboat moved through the gray water toward the main channel. A seagull landed on the chain-link fence and assessed them with the complete moral indifference of a creature that had never been required to care about anyone's history. Sienna looked at all of it and breathed. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple. She had understood they wouldn't be. Clean and simple were not things that happened after the kind of night the city had experienced. What happened instead was the slower, more difficult work of aftermath. The federal investigation expanding outward from the initial Pierce arrests into the Falcone structure, the Vass accounts, the 11 individuals whose names were on documents that Adelman's team had been analyzing for 16 hours straight by the time the sun came up on New Year's Day. Blackthorne's news infrastructure consumed the story with the focused intensity of an organism encountering abundant nutrition, and the city talked about it the way cities talked about things that confirmed what they'd always suspected about the people who ran them. The 47 workers in the Pierce Corporation's debt bondage contracts were released from their obligations on January 4th by order of a federal court acting on an emergency motion that Adelman's office filed with a speed that suggested the calls Sienna had asked her to make had been made. She read the court order in the kitchen of her mother's cafe, her cafe now, the one in Portside that her mother had run for 12 years on margins so thin they were practically theoretical, and she sat with it for a long time before she put it down. She had reopened the cafe the week before, not in a grand way. She simply showed up one morning with cleaning supplies and opened the door and started making coffee, and the regulars who had been coming to that corner for years materialized one by one with the specific loyalty of people who had been waiting for something to come back and were not going to make a fuss about the fact that it had. The cafe became the operational headquarters of something she had not planned and was still in the process of naming. Adelman's office connected her with a nonprofit attorney who specialized in labor exploitation cases. She connected the attorney with the 17 workers whose immigration status was most precarious. The attorney connected her with 3 other advocacy organizations who were working parallel cases in different parts of the city. And the network that formed from those connections was not glamorous. It was paperwork and phone calls and the slow grinding work of bureaucratic systems that didn't naturally incline toward helping the people who needed them most. But it was real, and it was moving, and it was hers. She learned to run the foundation properly. Roman's legal team transferred the endowment architecture to her direct oversight, and she spent 2 weeks with an accountant and a program director learning how funding mechanisms worked and what they could be made to do by someone who was paying attention. She found that the work suited her in the same way that kitchen work suited her. It rewarded the kind of specific, granular competence that didn't announce itself, the ability to manage multiple moving parts simultaneously without losing the thread of what any of it was for. She was tired in ways she hadn't been tired before, and she was also, underneath the tiredness, something that she didn't have a clean word for. Not happy. Happiness was too light a word for it, too unearned. Something more foundational. The specific quality of a person who has found the thing they are actually built for and is doing it, without apology, in the place they actually are. Roman came to the cafe on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the gala. He walked in the front door like a civilian, which struck her as the strangest thing she had seen him do, because it meant he had chosen to use the door that everyone used rather than the one that gave him an operational advantage, and that choice communicated something she hadn't needed to be told, but was glad to see demonstrated. He sat at the counter. She poured him coffee without asking. He looked at the cafe, the walls, the regulars, the photographs her mother had put up 20 years ago that she hadn't taken down, the specific worn warmth of a place that had been loved into its current shape over decades. "Your mother built this," he said. "My mother built this," she agreed. "It suits you." She looked at him across the counter. His shoulder was healing. She could see it in the way he held himself, the compensatory tension reduced, the movement more natural. His color was better. He looked like a person who had been through something and was on the far side of it and was figuring out what the far side looked like. "Adelman's office called me yesterday," she said. "I know. She wants a formal statement about the Vass operation, what I did in the building." "I know. She also said that the Castelli organization is going to be subject to a structured oversight agreement for the next 3 years as part of the broader settlement. She held his eyes. She said the terms were negotiated cooperatively. They were, Roman said. You negotiated away operational independence for 3 years. I negotiated a structure that allows the parts of the organization worth preserving to continue operating with federal visibility and the parts that aren't worth preserving to stop. He picked up his coffee. It's the correct outcome. She looked at him. You could have run. After the corridor, after Adelman. You had the resources. Yes. Why didn't you? He set the coffee down and looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was simply his default mode of being with her. Not performed, not managed, just the unmediated version of a person who had run out of reasons to be otherwise. Because I was done running things, he said. I've been running things since I was 22 years old and I'm 36, and I've been running in the same direction for 14 years and arrived at a corridor in a building in West Haven District where a woman I've known for 36 hours refused to leave. He paused. It seemed like a reasonable moment to stop. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, You could have told me. The first night. In the car. You could have told me all of it. No, he said. You would have made a different choice. Maybe. You would have, he said. Not arrogant, certain, in the way of a person who had spent years reading situations. You would have decided it was manipulation and gotten out of the car and walked to the bus stop and taken the number 9 home, and that would have been the correct decision for the person you were before that night. He looked at her. I needed you to make the choice you actually made, not the choice that would have kept you safe. She sat with that. The complicated moral architecture of it, the truth embedded in it alongside the manipulation, the two things braided together so tightly they couldn't be separated cleanly. She had spent 3 weeks thinking about this and had arrived at the same place every time, which was that the unbraiding was not the point. The point was what had been built from it, what she had built from it with her own hands, the same hands that had been scarred and rough and visible before anyone had put a silk dress on them. I'm keeping the foundation, she said. I know. And the cafe. And the culinary school. I found a property on Chandler Street, a former warehouse space, the right size, the right location. I'm in negotiations. She looked at him. I don't need your money for it. I have the endowment and a grant from the City Arts Council and a matching commitment from one of the nonprofit attorneys' donor network. I know that too, he said. You're not going to offer to fund it anyway. No, he said. You'd say no, and you'd be right. He looked at her with that particular steadiness. I'm here for coffee. She looked at him for a moment. Then she poured him more coffee and turned back to the counter and began prep for the morning service, which started in 20 minutes, and which she was going to be short-staffed for because Daniela had called out sick, and she hadn't found a replacement yet. Roman stayed at the counter for 2 hours and did not talk unnecessarily. He drank 3 cups of coffee and read something on his phone, and when the morning rush came in, he moved his stool to make room without being asked, and he watched her work with the specific attention of someone observing a competence they respected and were not going to interrupt. When the rush cleared, he left a 20 on the counter and stood up and said, Tomorrow? She was wiping down the espresso machine. She didn't look up. The culinary school is going to need a board of directors, she said. People who understand how the city actually works, not just the surface version. A pause. Yes. The meetings are on Tuesdays. She looked up. 7 in the morning. Don't be late. Something happened in his face that was not the contained fractional shift she had been reading for 3 weeks. It was larger than that. Not dramatic. Roman Castelli's face was not built for dramatic expressions, had clearly been trained against them over years of operating in rooms where showing what you felt was a liability. But it was there, open and real and entirely unmanaged, and she recognized it because she had the same thing in herself. The specific look of a person who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has just been given, without warning, a place to set it down. 7, he said. Understood. He left. Sienna turned back to the espresso machine and finished wiping it down with the careful attention the work deserved, and the cafe settled into its mid-morning quiet around her. The regulars with their newspapers and their routines, The particular sound of a room where people had been coming long enough to be comfortable, the smell of coffee and warm bread and the specific accumulated warmth of years of use. She thought about her father. She thought about him the way she'd been thinking about him for 3 weeks, not with the grief that had been the dominant note for the 8 months since her mother died, not with the particular ache of someone measuring the distance between the person they'd lost and the space they'd left, but with something cleaner. The specific gratitude of a person who understands, finally, that the life they've inherited from someone isn't a debt to be carried, but a direction to move in. He had stood on a corner in the dark and seen 3 against 1 and done the math and changed it. She thought about what she was doing with the 47 workers and the culinary school and the cafe and the network of attorneys and advocates that was taking shape from the harbor district outward into parts of the city that the foundation's money had never previously reached. She thought about the specific math of what she was doing, the resources on one side, the need on the other, the daily work of trying to adjust the distribution. She thought, this is what it looks like. This is the thing he started. Outside, the harbor was doing what it did. The cranes moving, the water running, the city operating on its enormous, indifferent axis. Inside the cafe, Sienna Vale made coffee and thought about directions and did not wait for anyone to tell her she was built for this. She already knew. She had known since a wet January alley at 11:13 at night, when a door opened and a man said her name and she made a choice that nobody made for her. That was the beginning of it. Everything else was just the work.